Aloha. Welcome to the first half of Lecture 14. Lecture 14, we're going to be discussing Chapter 10, which is how to make a face. So I have here one of the most iconic faces in the world. And we're going to discuss how we got from this to that, which is a pretty big... Wow, that's a pretty big leap. Anyway, so yeah, we're going to talk about how the face forms. While we're in the area, we're going to also talk about the formation of the pharynx and the neck. And we're going to have just a little bit of a snippet from chapter 17 about the eyes and a little bit about the ears. So the first thing that we've got to talk about, if you want to talk about how a face is formed, is these guys right here. 1, 2, 3, 4. The pharyngeal arches. The next thing that you got to talk about is this guy right here, the stomodium, right? This guy is destined to become the mouth. And at first, it's covered by this thing called the oropharyngeal membrane. Now, if we take this guy and turn him to face us, right? So just to get you oriented, this right here is this frontal brain eminence, right? And then, so yeah, we're just basically turning this guy sideways to look straight at us. Boom. So we have the first pharyngeal arch. We have the heart prominence here, and then this is that oropharyngeal membrane in the stomodium, okay? Now this is a diagram at about 26 days, which is roughly when the oropharyngeal membrane begins to rupture. You can see they put little holes in it, right? And when this happens, the gut tube comes into communication with the amniotic cavity. Now here's what it looks like at 28 days. Now it looks like the first pharyngeal arch has split, but it actually hasn't. It's just that it's developed two very significant prominences, which causes a fold in the middle of it. So it's not that it's split, it's just that it's folded a little bit, right? So we have the stomodium here, we have the nasal placodes, and we've got the second, third pharyngeal arch, etc. This is, again, the heart prominence, okay? Just to get you all oriented in where we're at. Now, there are 6 arches in all, but only 4 of them are ever visible from the outside. And just like the arteries, number 5 is transient and may not ever form at all. About half the time it doesn't. And when it does form, it doesn't amount to much, okay? So before we can discuss what these things are going to turn into, we've got to discuss what they are made up of. What are they made out of? The arch is developed from neural crest tissue that migrates down from the embryo, or migrates down as the embryo folds, right? So you have this neural crest tissue above the neural plate, and as the embryo folds, that neural crest tissue follows it as it folds and winds up in the mouth area, okay? In the area of the face, okay? By the way, this diagram is going to be on the quiz. We're going to see this diagram again, so, and it's a bugger. But anyway, so to begin with, there is a core of mesenchyme, right? So we have this pink stuff. That is the mesenchyme core. On the inside here, we have endoderm. So there's a lining of endoderm on the inside of the pharyngeal arches. And then on the outside, they are covered by ectoderm. So we've got ectoderm out here. We have endoderm in here. And then we have this core of mesenchyme. Now, within this core of mesenchyme, the arch develops a rod of cartilage, and this rod of cartilage, you know, it runs all the way through the arch, and it actually helps to support the arch and help it maintain its shape. Okay, we also have a central artery and a central nerve that runs straight through the arch, and then we also develop a band of muscle tissue that runs through the entire arch. Okay, so we have muscle tissue, nerve tissue, cartilage tissue, a central artery. We have a core of mesenchyme lined on the outside by ectoderm and on the inside by endoderm. Okay? Now, The pharyngeal arches are separated on the outside by these indentations called pharyngeal grooves. Right, on the outside they call them grooves. Its counterpart on the inside is called a pouch. I think the reason they called them pouches on the inside was because some guy needed to call them something different so he could get his PhD. But on the outside we have grooves, and on the inside we have pouches. Now this space in between the arch and the pouch, or the groove and the pouch rather, is called the pharyngeal membrane, right? So we have, and these are numbered from cranial to caudal. So up here we have the first pharyngeal arch, and then we have the first pharyngeal groove, and on the inside the first pharyngeal pouch, and in between them the first pharyngeal membrane. And then we have the second arch, the second groove, the second pouch, and the second membrane, and so on and so forth as we move down. Okay, hopefully that's as clear as mud. Now, we're going to talk briefly first about the cartilage, the pharyngeal arch cartilages. Only parts of 1, 2, and 3 are ultimately going to become bones, all right? So cartilage 1 here, pharyngeal arch cartilage 1, is going to become the malleus. Over here, it's going to become the incus, and it's going to become part of the stapes. Now, part of the cartilage is going to degenerate, and as it degenerates, it's going to leave behind the perichondrial membrane, right? The membrane around the cartilage, and that's going to form these two ligaments right here, the sphenomandibular ligament and the anterior ligament of the malleus, right? So that's basically what's going to happen with the first pharyngeal arch. The second arch, or sorry, the second cartilage is going to form the other part of the stapes here. It's going to form this top part, the lesser cornu of the hyoid bone. And then it's also going to, similarly, some of that cartilage is going to degenerate away and leave behind the perichondrium, which forms this stylohyoid ligament. All right, cartilages 4 through 6, cartilage 3, I'm getting ahead of myself. Cartilage 3 is going to form the other part of the hyoid bone. This guy right here is going to form the other part of the hyoid bone. And then cartilages 4 through 6 are going to become the thyroid and the cricoid cartilage. But these two guys are never going to ossify. I mean, as you get old, they ossify a little bit, but they're going to basically stay cartilage your whole life, right? So that's what 4 and 6 become. And remember, 5 is transient. It doesn't really become anything and only appears on half of people anyway. Don't know why. I know that nature is conservative, so I would imagine that somewhere in our evolution it was used for something. We just haven't figured that out yet. But currently, nobody really knows what the 5th arch is for. It's just transient. If it's there for a little while and it disappears. So for the quiz, you are going to want to remember, and the exam, you're going to want to remember that cartilages 1, 2, and 3 become bones and ligaments. Cartilages 4 and 6 form the thyroid and cricoid cartilages and do not ossify. So let me say that one more time so you'll have a chance to write it down. Okay, cartilages 1, 2, and 3 are going to become bones and ligaments. Cartilage 4 and 6 are going to form the thyroid and cricoid cartilages and do not ossify. Now then, let's talk about the muscular component of the arches. Okay, it's not important for this class, it's not important for the quiz or anything, but some of the muscle cells do migrate down from the occipital myotomes, and they contribute to the structures formed in the first arch muscle, right? Again, for purposes of this class, we're not going to get into that great of detail, but just for your information, some of the muscle cells in this first arch come down from these occipital myotomes, okay? Also, that explains the arrows and stuff on the diagram for those who are wondering. At any rate, the first arch is going to form primarily the muscles of mastication, right? Specifically, the masseter muscle and the temporalis muscle. It's also going to form the mylohyoid and the geniohyoid right next to it here. It's going to form a few other things. It's going to form the little teeny tiny stapedius muscle and the tensor veli palatini. So the stapedius muscle is right in this area somewhere. The tensor veli palatini is somewhere in here, and it controls your the opening of your eustachian tube. Okay. So the second arch, this guy right here, is going to form a whole bunch of different muscles. Most of them are the muscles of facial expression. It forms a few other things like the stylohyoid muscle, one of the bellies of the digastric muscle, the platysma muscle, the occipitalis muscle, which really these guys are actually part of your facial expression anyway, because this guy stretches your scalp. And, you know, this anyway. If any of you know who Barney Fife is, he made excellent use of this platysma muscle in his facial expressions, but generally speaking, only old people know about him. Old people like me. Anyway, yeah. So the important thing to remember is that pharyngeal arch 2, the muscular component of pharyngeal arch 2, is going to form mostly the muscles of facial expression over here. Okay. So the third arch is going to form the stylopharyngeus muscle. Sorry, this guy right here, the stylopharyngeus muscle, is going to run from the styloid process to the pharynx. The muscles of 4 and 6 are going to become the swallowing muscles. These guys down here, they don't show all of them in the diagram, but that's okay. So 4 and 6, remember 5 doesn't really do anything, but 4 and 6 are going to mostly become the muscles that you use to swallow. Okay, now for the quiz, the things that you're going to want to know for the quiz from that section are, first, the second arch here forms primarily the muscles of facial expression. And 4 through 6 form the swallowing muscles. Remember those two things, they will be on the quiz. 4 and 6, swallowing muscles. Second arch, facial expression muscles. Now, let's move on to the nerve component. The important takeaway here, okay? The important thing to remember, we're not going to cover much else, but the important thing to remember is that every arch has a dedicated cranial nerve, right? The fourth arch has cranial nerve 10. The third arch has cranial nerve 9. The second arch has cranial nerve 7. The first arch has cranial nerve 5, right? So every arch, every pharyngeal arch has a dedicated cranial nerve. And why that matters is because all of the structures that these arches form are going to be innervated by that nerve that's dedicated to that pharyngeal arch. Make sense? So, for example, the second arch becomes the muscles of facial expression, which are innervated by nerve 7, right? 4 through 6 are going to become the swallowing muscles, which are innervated by cranial nerve 10. Does this all make sense, right? So yeah, whatever structures these arches form are going to be innervated by the nerve that went out to that arch. Because remember, these nerves go out a long time before the embryo even folds. These nerves are already out there, and they just follow the structures that they innervate to wherever in the body they go, whether it be into the arms or the heart or, you know, whatever. Anyway, so I beat that dead horse to death. But yes, it might be on a quiz, so I'll say it one more time to make sure you got it written down. Each arch has a dedicated cranial nerve. The structures associated with that arch are innervated by that nerve, right? All structures are innervated by the nerve associated with the pharyngeal arch that they were formed from. Okay, anyway, so we're going to move on and talk more about these grooves and these pouches. There's some action going on here, you know, there's some pretty cool stuff going on here. The grooves, they're a lot less exciting. There's not a whole lot that goes on with the grooves. For a little while, the second, third, and fourth grooves form this structure called the cervical sinus. They invaginate in a little bit, but this disappears as the neck develops. It fills in, it disappears. By the time you're down here, it's gone. Okay, the only one that actually does anything interesting is this first pharyngeal groove up here. So this first pharyngeal groove is going to deepen, and as it deepens, it's going to become the external ear canal, the external acoustic meatus, if you want to speak fancy Latin words. And that is going to persist into adulthood. Okay. And that's about it for that. By the way, that is going to be on the quiz. Okay, the first groove is going to form the external ear canal, right? And anyway, that's about it for the grooves. They don't do much else that's interesting, which is going to bring us to the pouches. Now, the first pharyngeal pouch up here, it deepens and it expands, right? Up here, it gets deeper and it gets bigger. And as it gets bigger and deeper, it's going to form both the middle ear cavity and it's going to form the eustachian tube. In this book, it's called the pharyngotympanic tube. The pharyngotympanic tube, which you and I know as the eustachian tube. Okay, so the middle ear and the eustachian tube, middle ear cavity. Also, not to forget about it, remember that skinny space in between that first pharyngeal membrane. As these guys both deepen, that first pharyngeal membrane is going to become very, very thin, and it's going to form a very thin membrane known as the tympanic membrane, which we also call the eardrum. Right, so kind of some exciting stuff happening with that first groove in that first pouch. So the first pharyngeal groove becomes the external ear canal. The first pharyngeal pouch becomes the middle ear and the eustachian tube, and then the first pharyngeal membrane becomes the eardrum. I'm going to say that one more time in case it appears on a quiz. The first pharyngeal groove becomes the external acoustic meatus or the external ear canal. The first pharyngeal pouch becomes the middle ear cavity and the eustachian tube. And the first pharyngeal membrane becomes the eardrum or the tympanic membrane. Okay? Now, the second pouch is going to become it's going to fill in, but it's going to fill in with this palatine tonsil, right? So second pouch here, it's going to start to fill in with, so the tonsil itself is made out of mesenchyme. So this mesenchyme starts to proliferate and fill in this space, and that forms the tonsil. But then the endoderm is also going to proliferate, and as that endoderm tissue proliferates, it's going to invaginate into this tonsil, causing the tonsillar crypts, right? And so that is how the palatine tonsil is going to form. And you can see the palatine tonsil right here as well. By the way, you know, these diagrams, some of them are going to be on the quiz, so pay attention to these diagrams too. If I remember right, it's mostly this diagram that's on the quiz. But we'll get to that on the quiz review. If you're not going to come to the quiz review, well, then I would just study all the diagrams because I really like to put diagrams on the quiz. Anyway, pouch 3, some interesting things happen. To pouch number 3. It develops this bulbous part up at the top, and then it starts to develop this long, hollow section at the bottom. And what's going to happen is this structure here is going to detach. It's going to detach right from here, and then it's going to travel down, and as it travels down, it's going to flip over, right? So you see that here. This part used to be up here, and now it's down here. It went boop, right? And this part used to be down here, and now it's up here, right? So as it travels down, it inverts. Now, this tube part, this hollow tube part at the top, is going to become the inferior parathyroid gland. It's going to pretty well stay put and differentiate into the inferior parathyroid gland. This bulbous part that used to be at the top, that's now at the bottom, it's going to detach and it's going to migrate down into the chest, into the mediastinum, and it is going to become the thymus, which is pretty interesting. The thymus gland down in your chest used to be up in your mouth. Anyway, yeah, so that's about it for the third one. Now the fourth one also starts to form, you know, a top structure and a bottom structure. Um, so this top part of the fourth arch, or the fourth pouch rather, the top part of the fourth pouch is going to become the superior thyroid gland, parathyroid gland. It's going to pretty much stay where it's at and form that parathyroid gland. I guess it's going to migrate down a little bit according to the diagram, but it's not going to go very far. And it's going to become the superior parathyroid gland right here. Pouch 4, pouch 3 is the inferior parathyroid gland. This bottom part right here is going to become the ultimopharyngeal body, right? The ultimopharyngeal body. Such a mouthful. So the ultimopharyngeal body is ultimately going to be integrated into the thyroid gland, right? So you can see the ultimopharyngeal body right here. It's actually a pretty small structure that is integrated right into the thyroid gland right here, right? Now that's a good time to talk about the thyroid, the formation of the thyroid gland, okay? Now, something that you're going to want to know about the thyroid gland for the quiz is that it is the first functional endocrine gland. The thyroid gland is the first functional endocrine gland. Let me say that one more time. The thyroid gland is the first functional endocrine gland, right? So what's going to happen is as the tongue develops, you see right here, we've got the developing tongue. The endoderm is going to start to proliferate. And as this endoderm proliferates, it's going to invaginate into the floor of the tongue, or into the floor of the pharynx, I guess that would be. And this is going to form an outpouching. And this outpouching is start to migrate. It's going to start to migrate downward. And as it migrates downward, it's going to leave a fistula behind it. Right? This is called the thyroglossal duct. Don't worry, that will not be on the quiz. As the neck develops, this is going to fill in. This fistula is going to fill in and close off, and you're left with this thyroid gland right down here. And that thyroid gland, by about 7 weeks, has usually arrived at its final destination and its final shape. And then by about 20 weeks, it starts producing hormones. And by 35 weeks, it is fully functional. Next up, the tongue. So the tongue is formed by several different pharyngeal arches, right? So we have here the top the front 2/3 of the tongue are all formed by the first pair of arches. The first pair of pharyngeal arches forms the front 2/3 of the tongue. The back third is developed of the second, third, and fourth arches. Now, this is important because there are different cranial nerves that innervate different parts of the tongue. This is why, right? Because remember, the cranial nerve associated with each arch will innervate the structures that form from that arch. So we have parts of arch number 3 and 4 and 2 that all brought the cranial nerves with them. And then we also have parts of cranial nerve 1, which brought the nerves with them. Or I'm sorry, pharyngeal arch 1, which is cranial nerve 5. Anyway, so yeah, we have all these different pharyngeal arches involved that brought the cranial nerves with them. So you have different parts of the tongue innervated by different nerves. Okay, I think I said that 2 or 3 times, and it's a good thing that I said that 2 or 3 times because it's probably going to be on a quiz. The reason that the tongue is innervated by different cranial nerves, different parts of the tongue, is because those different parts of the tongue were formed from different pharyngeal arch tissue. So what happens first is you get this little tiny central swelling in the first pharyngeal arch called the median lingual swelling. And this is due to a proliferation of the mesenchyme of the arch. After that, you start to see these 2 lateral swellings just to either side of it. Now, these 2 lateral swellings are going to very quickly overgrow this guy, this medial swelling, and he is going to disappear and never be heard from again. And these guys are going to take over. They're going to get very big. They're going to zip together in the middle, and you're going to end up with the front 2/3 of the tongue. Okay. The next thing that happens is you get this little growth in the second arch called the copula. Okay. And this copula, inferior. Just caudal, inferior caudal, same thing. So just caudal to that, the third and fourth arches start to form this great big eminence called the hypopharyngeal eminence, right? Now this hypopharyngeal eminence is going to overgrow this guy, this copula, and it's going to pretty well disappear, but that's not going to happen before it brings a whole bunch of nerve fibers from cranial nerve 7 in, which is going to innervate a significant portion of the tongue. Cranial nerve 7 is going to innervate the taste buds of a significant portion of the tongue because this copula brought those nerve fibers with it. Oops, sorry. Basically the hypopharyngeal eminence gets big, differentiates further, and forms this back 2/3 of the tongue. And then, of course, same thing happens. They fuse together, and on we go. So papillae, which is what the taste buds are going to eventually form from these papillae, you start to see papillae developing on the surface of the tongue, all over the tongue, at about 10 to 11 weeks. And these start to form near the ends of the associated nerves. And then somewhere between 11 and 13 weeks, the taste buds fully form. And what's really cool is that by 26 weeks, well, somewhere between 26 and 28 weeks, if you put a sour taste in the fetus's mouth, the fetus will actually make a sour face, which is really cool to me. Whoever got the bright idea to put something sour in a fetus's mouth to see if it would make a face, I have no idea what kind of drugs that guy was on, but it is really cool that between 26 and 28 weeks somewhere, this baby will start making a sour face if you put something in its mouth that tastes bad. Next up is the salivary glands. Okay. There's not a whole lot to talk about with the salivary glands. The glandular tissue itself is derived from epithelial cells in the mouth, and that stems from ectoderm. The connective tissues that support the glands, right, that the gland is hanging out in, the connective tissues that I guess it's attached to. Anyway, that stuff comes from mesenchyme, of course. And that mesenchyme was derived from neural crest tissue. At any rate, they start to develop during the 6th and 7th weeks. The parotid gland forms first. Next is the submandibular gland, followed by the sublingual glands. And that's about the gist of it. That's really all there is to say. What you're going to want to hang on to for the quiz, so write this down. What you're going to want to remember for the quiz is that the salivary glands are derived from ectoderm tissue. They start developing in the 6th week, and the parotid gland is first, this guy up here. Okay, so one more time. They're derived from ectoderm. They start developing in the 6th week, and the parotid gland is the first one. Okay, now that is going to do it for the first half of the lecture. Pretty much focused on the stuff inside the pharynx and the larynx, the internal structures of the mouth and the face. Next time, we're going to talk about the formation of the structures of the face itself, right? The nose, the lips, the mouth, the chin, all that stuff that makes your face your face. We're going to start covering that stuff in the second half of this lecture. So that'll be it for today. If you have any questions or if you need anything clarified, as always, please write the questions down or you will forget them, I promise. Write the questions down, bring them with you to the Zoom meeting on Thursday, and try your best to stump me. It still hasn't happened in this class. I keep waiting for somebody to bring me the question I can't answer so that we can offer you guys all extra credit. But yeah, that's it for today. We'll see you back for the second half of the lecture later this week. Aloha.